Picture this. It's 252 million years ago, and Earth is alive in ways you can barely imagine. The oceans are warm, almost tropical, teeming with creatures that look like they came from another planet. Trilobites, those ancient armoured arthropods that have been crawling across the seafloor for 270 million years, scuttle through shallow waters. Massive coral reefs stretch for miles, built not by the corals we know today, but by ancient species that had perfected reef building over hundreds of millions of years. On land, forests of seed ferns and conifers blanket the supercontinent Pangaea. Creatures called synapsids, the distant ancestors of mammals, lumber through the undergrowth. Some are tiny, rat-sized things. Others are enormous, hippo-sized beasts with strange sail-like structures on their backs. Flying insects with 2-foot wingspans drift through the humid air. Life is everywhere, in the oceans, on the land, in the air. Billions of years of evolution have created an almost unimaginable diversity of species. The planet is thriving. But something is about to happen. Something so catastrophic, so utterly devastating, that it will make every other extinction event in Earth's history look minor by comparison. You've probably heard of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That famous extinction that wiped out the T-Rex and the Triceratops and gave mammals their chance to inherit the Earth. That was bad. Really bad. About 75% of all species went extinct. But what was coming 252 million years ago was worse. Far worse. When it was over, roughly 90% of all species on Earth would be gone. Not just gone extinct, but erased so completely that we're still finding their fossils and realizing we have no idea what they were. In the oceans, the devastation was even more extreme. 96% of all marine species vanished. Entire groups of animals that had dominated the seas for hundreds of millions of years simply ceased to exist. The trilobites, those successful arthropods that had survived every crisis Earth had thrown at them for nearly 300 million years, were completely annihilated. Every single species. Gone. Scientists call it the Permian-Triassic extinction event. But that technical name doesn't really capture what happened. Some call it the Great Dying. That's better. That gets closer to the truth. This was the closest complex life on Earth has ever come to complete annihilation. And here's what makes it so terrifying. It wasn't a single catastrophic event like an asteroid impact. It was a cascade of disasters that fed on each other, amplifying and multiplying until the planet became almost uninhabitable. It took maybe 60,000 years for everything to fall apart. That sounds like a long time, but in geological terms it's the blink of an eye. If you're using this to fall asleep, good. That's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at twilight, London at lunch, all at once. There's something peaceful about knowing we're all here together, learning about the deep past while the present quietly ticks by. The question that haunts scientists is simple but profound. What could possibly kill 90% of all life on Earth? What force could be so powerful, so relentless, that it could devastate ecosystems that had been stable for tens of millions of years? Was it volcanic eruptions, climate change, poison gas, acid rain, oxygen depletion? The answer, as we'll discover, is all of the above, and worse. See, for a long time, nobody really understood what happened at the end of the Permian period. The fossil record showed a sudden, dramatic disappearance of species, but the cause was a complete mystery. Some scientists thought it was gradual climate change. Others proposed multiple, smaller extinction events. A few even suggested that life on Earth was hit by gamma rays from an exploding star. But in the last few decades, as we've developed better tools for reading Earth's geological history, the true story has started to emerge. And it's more terrifying than anyone imagined. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a perfect storm of catastrophes, each one triggering the next, until the entire planet was caught in a death spiral that lasted for thousands of years. What you're about to hear is the story of how Earth almost died. How a thriving, diverse planet full of bizarre and beautiful creatures was transformed into a nearly lifeless wasteland. And how, against all odds, life managed to cling on and eventually recover. This is the story of the Great Dying. Let's begin. 252 million years ago, Earth looked like nothing you'd recognize today. Forget the 7 continents separated by vast oceans. Forget the familiar shapes of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The planet had done something extraordinary. Something that happens only once every few 100 million years. It had gathered all its land masses together into a single massive supercontinent. Scientists call it Pangaea. The name means all Earth in ancient Greek, and it's disturbingly literal. Imagine looking at a globe where almost all the land is clustered on one side, forming a gigantic C-shaped mass that stretches from pole to pole. On one side, the endless Panthalassic Ocean, a body of water so vast it makes the Pacific look like a pond. On the other, the Tethys Sea, cutting into Pangaea's eastern coast like a giant bite taken from the supercontinent. This wasn't just unusual geography. This was a completely alien planet operating under rules that no longer apply. When you put all the land in one place, strange things happen to climate, to evolution, to the very nature of life itself. And 252 million years ago, life on this alien Earth had reached a kind of pinnacle. Not the pinnacle of size or complexity that would come later with dinosaurs and mammals, but a different kind of success. A world where evolution had been running its experiments for hundreds of millions of years, creating ecosystems that were rich, diverse, and remarkably stable. The forests that covered vast stretches of Pangaea weren't like modern forests. Walk through them and you'd immediately know something was wrong, or rather, different in ways that would make your brain itch with unfamiliarity. The trees were there, yes, but these weren't oaks or maples or pines as we know them. These were seed ferns, massive plants that looked like ferns but reproduced like modern trees. In the southern reaches of Pangaea, entire forests consisted of Glossopteris, a distinctive plant with tongue-shaped leaves that would later provide some of the first evidence that the continents had once been connected. These weren't scattered groves. These were forests that stretched for thousands of miles, dense, swampy woodlands where the air hung thick and humid, where the ground was perpetually soft with decay, where life piled on life in endless cycles of growth and decomposition. Mixed among the seed ferns were early conifers, the distant ancestors of modern pine and spruce trees. They were just beginning their evolutionary rise, developing the adaptations that would eventually make them masters of harsh environments. But in the Permian world, they were still figuring things out, still experimenting with different strategies for survival. The forests weren't silent. That's something people always get wrong about ancient Earth. They imagine a quiet world, a planet waiting for life to get noisy. But the Permian forest buzzed and hummed and clicked, with a soundscape that would seem absolutely alien to modern ears. Insects were everywhere. Not just everywhere, but bigger than anything you've seen outside a nightmare. Dragonfly ancestors with wingspans approaching 2.5 feet patrolled the swamps like prehistoric helicopters. Millipedes the size of crocodiles rustled through the undergrowth. These weren't monsters in the sense we usually mean. They were just animals, products of millions of years of evolution in a world where atmospheric oxygen levels were slightly different, where the constraints on insect size hadn't yet solidified into the limits we see today. But the real stars of the Permian world, the animals that dominated the land like nothing before or since, weren't insects. They were synapsids. Now that's a word you probably haven't heard since high school biology, if then. But you need to understand synapsids because they were our ancestors. Not metaphorically, not in some vague evolutionary sense. These were the animals that would eventually, after millions of years and countless evolutionary experiments, become mammals, become us. The most successful synapsids of the late Permian were the therapsids, sometimes called mammal-like reptiles, though that name is misleading. They weren't really reptiles at all. They were something else, something in between, occupying ecological niches that wouldn't exist again until mammals filled them 200 million years later. Picture something like a dog-sized creature covered in possibly the first true hair in Earth's history, walking not with the sprawling gait of modern reptiles, but with legs positioned underneath its body, allowing for efficient movement. Some species were herbivores, like Lystrosaurus, a pig-like creature with a turtle's beak that browsed on the low vegetation covering the forest floors and riverbanks. Others were predators, like the Gorgonopsids, terrifying apex predators with massive saber teeth and powerful builds that let them take down prey several times their size. These weren't dumb animals. Fossil evidence suggests many therapsids had relatively large brains for their body size. They probably cared for their young, something most reptiles don't do. They might have been warm-blooded, or at least somewhere on the spectrum between cold and warm-blooded, developing the metabolic innovations that would eventually let mammals dominate the planet. They were successful beyond measure. Therapsids had diversified into dozens of different forms, filling every possible ecological role. Small insectivores, massive herbivores, medium-sized omnivores, specialized carnivores. They'd been doing this for millions of years, refining their adaptations, perfecting their survival strategies. By the late Permian, synapsids made up around 70% of all land vertebrate species. They were the undisputed masters of terrestrial life. Everything else, early reptiles, amphibians, was secondary, marginal, waiting in the evolutionary wings. But the land was only half the story. Beneath the waves of the Panthalassic Ocean and the Tethys Sea, a completely different world thrived. Ancient coral reefs stretched for hundreds of miles along Pangaea's coastlines. These weren't the coral reefs you'd recognize from modern documentaries. The corals themselves were different species, creating different structures, but they served the same function, providing the foundation for entire ecosystems, creating complexity where there would otherwise be empty sea floor. Swimming through these reefs were creatures that looked like they'd been designed by a committee that couldn't decide what a marine animal should look like. Trilobites, those iconic fossils that anyone who's ever visited a natural history museum has seen, were still abundant. They'd been around for 270 million years by this point, ancient even by Permian standards, existing in hundreds of different species adapted to every possible marine environment. Some were predators, some scavengers, some filter feeders. They crawled across the ocean floor on dozens of tiny legs, their compound eyes taking in a world that existed long before anything resembling a fish as we know them. Brachiopods filtered nutrients from the water, looking superficially like clams but unrelated, representing a completely different solution to the problem of surviving as a sessile marine animal. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, waved their feather-like arms in the currents, capturing tiny organisms and organic particles. These weren't plants despite their appearance. They were animals, relatives of modern starfish and sea urchins, anchored to the seafloor and living lives of patient filtration. And then there were the ammonoids, relatives of modern nautilus, swimming through the water columns with their coiled shells. Some species grew shells the size of truck tires. Others remained tiny, filling different ecological niches, pursuing different evolutionary strategies. They were incredibly diverse, incredibly successful, having survived previous mass extinctions and bounced back stronger than before. The ocean was full. Not full in the sense of being crowded, but full in the sense that every possible way of making a living in the sea had been discovered, refined, perfected over hundreds of millions of years. Predator and prey relationships had reached complex equilibriums. Food webs stretched from microscopic plankton to massive predatory fish, creating interconnected systems of staggering complexity. The climate of this Permian world was, broadly speaking, warm. Not uniformly warm, Pangaea was so massive that its interior regions formed vast deserts where almost nothing could survive. But along the coasts, in the forests, near the equator, conditions were generally favourable for life. Seasonal variations existed, particularly in the higher latitudes, but nothing like the dramatic ice ages that had punctuated earlier periods of Earth history. The planet had settled into a kind of comfortable routine. Stable climate patterns, well-established ecosystems, evolutionary lineages that had been successful for millions of years continuing to be successful. This is what makes what came next so devastating. This wasn't a marginal ecosystem barely hanging on, vulnerable to the slightest disruption. This was life at its peak, having had hundreds of millions of years to diversify, to establish itself, to create redundancy and resilience. The Permian world represented the culmination of evolution's experiments since complex life first emerged from the oceans. Every organism alive in the late Permian was a survivor, the product of an unbroken chain of successful reproduction stretching back to the origin of life itself. Every species had weathered countless challenges, outlasted numerous competitors, adapted to changing conditions over geological timescales. The synapsids dominating the land had ancestors that survived the Carboniferous rainforest collapse 305 million years ago. The marine creatures thriving in the oceans carried genes tested through previous extinction events and environmental changes. These weren't fragile hothouse flowers. These were hardened survivors, the products of natural selection operating over timeframes so vast they make recorded human history look like a single breath. And yet, none of it mattered. None of the adaptations, none of the survival strategies, none of the millions of years of evolutionary refinement would be enough for what was coming. Because deep beneath Pangaea's surface, in what is now Siberia, geological forces were building toward a catastrophe that would make every previous disaster in Earth's history look gentle by comparison. Magma was rising, pressure was building, the planet's interior was preparing to vomit forth an apocalypse. The synapsids browsing peacefully on seed ferns had no way of knowing their world was about to end. The trilobites crawling across the ocean floor couldn't sense that they were part of an ancient lineage about to be completely erased. The forests growing in the humid coastal regions couldn't feel that they were about to burn. But the signs were already there. Subtle at first, so subtle that no organism alive could have detected them. Small increases in volcanic activity, minor fluctuations in ocean chemistry, tiny changes in atmospheric composition. The stage was set. The actors were in place. Life on Earth was about to face its greatest test, and 90% of all species were about to fail. 252 million years ago, in what we now call Siberia, the Earth's crust began to crack. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, like ice fracturing under too much weight. Deep beneath the surface, something vast was rising. A plume of superheated rock, hundreds of miles across, pushing upward from the boundary between Earth's mantle and core. It had been climbing for millions of years, gathering heat and pressure, forcing its way through thousands of feet of solid rock. And now, finally, it reached the surface. What happened next would change everything. The first eruptions were probably unremarkable by geological standards. Magma breaking through weakened crust, fountains of lava spraying into the air, flows spreading across the landscape. Maybe a few thousand square miles covered initially. Local devastation, certainly. Any plants or animals in the immediate area would have been incinerated. But nothing the Earth hadn't seen countless times before. Except this time, the eruptions didn't stop. Week after week, month after month, year after year, the lava kept coming. Not from a single volcano, not even from a chain of volcanoes, but from massive fissures in the Earth's crust, cracks that stretched for hundreds of miles. Magma wasn't building up into mountains. It was flooding across the landscape like water from a broken dam, except the water was molten rock at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is what geologists call a flood basalt event, and it's completely different from anything most people picture when they think about volcanoes. Forget the cone-shaped mountains you see in disaster movies. Forget the explosive eruptions that send ash clouds into the stratosphere. Flood basalts are something else entirely. Imagine cutting a gash in the Earth's surface and having magma simply pour out, flowing across the land in sheets hundreds of feet thick, moving slowly but relentlessly, consuming everything in their path. The flows would advance maybe a few miles per day, slow enough that you could walk away from them, but fast enough that any ecosystem in their path was doomed. And the scale. God, the scale was beyond anything in human experience. Within the first few thousand years, the Siberian traps, as geologists now call them, had covered an area the size of Western Europe. We're talking about roughly 2 million square miles buried under layer after layer of volcanic rock. Some of these lava flows were hundreds of feet thick individually, and they just kept stacking on top of each other, layer after layer, building up a volcanic plateau that in some places reached over a mile in thickness. Think about that for a moment. An entire continental scale region, roughly equivalent to France, Germany, Spain, Italy and Poland combined, covered in fresh lava. Every river diverted or boiled away. Every forest incinerated. Every animal that couldn't fly or run fast enough entombed in cooling rock. The local extinction was absolute and immediate, but that was just the beginning. The location of these eruptions was almost perfectly calculated to cause maximum planetary damage. Siberia, 252 million years ago, wasn't the frozen wasteland it is today. It was located further south, in temperate latitudes, with extensive forests and coal deposits laid down during the Carboniferous period, about 100 million years earlier. These coal beds were hundreds of feet thick in some places, compressed plant matter representing millions of years of accumulated carbon. When the lava flows encountered these coal deposits, something catastrophic happened. The intense heat didn't just burn the coal, it baked it, releasing gases that had been locked away for geological ages: carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds. All the carbon that plants had laboriously pulled from the atmosphere and locked underground over millions of years was suddenly being pumped back into the air at a rate thousands of times faster than any natural process. It was like setting fire to Earth's carbon bank vault, except the vault was the size of a continent, and the fire would burn for nearly 1 million years. The eruptions weren't constant, of course. They came in pulses, episodes of intense activity followed by quieter periods, then ramping up again, but they never really stopped. For somewhere between 600,000 and 2 million years, depending on which geological estimates you trust, the Siberian traps were active. That's not a typo. Not 600 days or 600 years, but 600,000 years minimum of sustained volcanic activity. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history from the first written languages to the present day covers about 5,000 years. The Siberian traps erupted for 120 times longer than all of human civilization. Homo sapiens as a species has existed for roughly 300,000 years. These volcanic eruptions lasted at least twice as long as our entire species has existed. And during all that time, they were pumping gases into the atmosphere at a rate that would make modern industrial emissions look like a campfire. The initial stages, perhaps the first few tens of thousands of years, probably didn't seem catastrophic on a global scale. Sure, Siberia was devastated. The lava flows had created a hellscape of cooling rock, toxic gases, and complete biological destruction. But Earth is a big place. Weather patterns might have carried some volcanic gases to other regions. Temperatures might have started to climb slightly. But life elsewhere probably continued more or less as normal. The problem was that the eruptions weren't releasing their gases in discrete bursts that the Earth system could process and reabsorb. They were creating a sustained, relentless input of greenhouse gases that was slowly, steadily overwhelming the planet's natural carbon cycle. It was like trying to bail water out of a boat while someone keeps pouring more in. For a while, you can keep up. Eventually, you can't. The scale of magma production was staggering. Modern estimates suggest the Siberian traps erupted somewhere between 1 and 4 million cubic miles of lava. To visualize that, imagine taking Mount Everest and creating 5,000 exact copies of it, made entirely of volcanic rock. That's roughly how much material came out of the Earth's interior. Except instead of piling up into mountains, it spread out in vast sheets across the landscape. This wasn't happening because of some random geological coincidence. The Earth's interior is constantly churning, with massive plumes of hot rock rising from deep in the mantle. These mantle plumes can persist for millions of years, feeding volcanic hotspots like the one that created the Hawaiian Islands. But usually the crust moves over these hotspots, creating chains of volcanoes as tectonic plates slide across them. The Siberian hotspot was different. The crust above it was thick continental rock, harder to break through than oceanic crust. When the mantle plume finally did punch through, it did so catastrophically, creating those massive fissures that would pump out lava for geological ages. And the continental location meant the eruptions were interacting with carbon-rich rocks, coal deposits, and sedimentary formations that amplified the atmospheric effects. As the decades turned into centuries and the centuries into millennia, the environmental effects started spreading beyond Siberia. Volcanic gases carried by upper atmosphere winds began affecting weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Acid rain, created when sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor, started falling in regions thousands of miles from the eruption sites. Rivers became more acidic, lakes began dying, and the temperature started rising. Not quickly, not in a way that would be immediately obvious to animals living at the time, but year by year, decade by decade, the global average temperature was climbing. The massive input of carbon dioxide was beginning to overwhelm Earth's natural cooling mechanisms. The planet's thermostat was broken, stuck on high, and there was no way to turn it down. By the time the eruptions had been going for 100,000 years, the effects were becoming undeniable. The Arctic regions, which had been relatively cool, started warming dramatically. Ice sheets that had existed for millions of years began to melt. Ocean currents, driven by the sinking of cold, dense water in polar regions, started to weaken and shift. And still the lava kept flowing. Animals in Siberia had long since fled or died. Nothing lived within hundreds of miles of the active eruption zones, except maybe a few hardy microbes in protected niches. The landscape was an alien hellscape of black rock, toxic fumes, and occasional rivers of glowing magma. But this local devastation was becoming irrelevant. The real catastrophe was atmospheric, chemical, global. Every day the Siberian traps released gases equivalent to what thousands of modern volcanoes would produce. Carbon dioxide in quantities that would take modern industrial civilization decades to match. Sulfur dioxide creating aerosols that scattered in the upper atmosphere, creating blood-red sunsets visible across half the planet. Chlorine and fluorine compounds that attack the ozone layer, allowing more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. The Earth system was being pushed further and further from equilibrium, and there was a feedback loop building, a dangerous positive feedback that would turn a severe crisis into a planetary catastrophe. As the planet warmed, the oceans absorbed heat, and as ocean water warmed, it could hold less dissolved oxygen. Less oxygen meant marine life had to work harder to breathe. Organisms living near the limits of their thermal tolerance started dying. Their bodies sank to the ocean floor, where bacteria decomposed them, consuming even more oxygen in the process. This created zones of oxygen-depleted water that spread outward and upward, killing more organisms, creating more decomposition, consuming more oxygen. The oceans were beginning to suffocate, and the dying oceans would release something far worse than anything the volcanoes had produced. But that was still to come, for now, maybe 150,000 years into the eruptions, life on Earth was stressed but still functioning. Species were dying, yes. Ecosystems were changing, absolutely. The world was becoming hotter, more acidic, more hostile. But most life persisted. Evolution had dealt with volcanic catastrophes before. It would adapt, it would survive. Except this time, the stress wasn't going to stop. The planet wasn't going to recover and return to normal. Because the Siberian traps were only the trigger, the initial push that would set in motion a cascade of environmental disasters, each one amplifying the others, feeding back into a death spiral that would nearly end life on Earth. The Earth had begun to fracture, and the cracks were spreading. What came next would make the volcanic eruptions themselves seem almost gentle by comparison. The first changes were invisible. That's the terrible thing about atmospheric catastrophes. You can't see carbon dioxide. You can't watch methane spreading through the air like smoke. The creatures living through the beginning of the end had no idea what was happening above them. They just knew that something was wrong. The air itself was becoming hostile. The Siberian traps had been pumping volcanic gases into the atmosphere for thousands of years by this point. But this wasn't like a single volcano erupting. This was hundreds of vents, fissures, and calderas, all releasing gases simultaneously across an area the size of Western Europe. Every day, millions of tons of carbon dioxide poured into the sky. Every week, the concentration in the atmosphere climbed higher. Every year, the planet trapped more heat. Scientists estimate that the Siberian traps release somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide over the course of their eruptions. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to burning all the fossil fuels humans have ever burned in our entire industrial history, then doing it again 4 or 5 more times, all compressed into less than 1 million years. Most of it in intense pulses lasting just decades or centuries. The greenhouse effect was immediate and brutal. Within the first few thousand years, global temperatures began climbing. Not the gentle warming of natural climate cycles, but a runaway spike that nothing alive had experienced before. Temperatures rose by 8 degrees Celsius in some regions, then 10. In certain areas, particularly inland continental zones, the rise reached 15 degrees or more. Imagine what that means in practical terms. Take whatever temperature your environment normally experiences and add 15 degrees. A temperate forest with summer highs of 25 degrees C suddenly facing regular temperatures of 40 degrees C. Desert regions that normally peaked at 45 degrees C now reaching 60 degrees C. Temperatures where proteins begin to denature, where cellular machinery starts breaking down. But the carbon dioxide was just the beginning. The magma rising through Siberia wasn't just pure molten rock. It was carrying with it dissolved gases that had been locked in the Earth's mantle for hundreds of millions of years. Sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen chloride, and hydrogen fluoride. These gases erupted alongside the lava, creating a toxic cocktail that spread through the atmosphere on global wind patterns. The sulfur dioxide was particularly devastating. When it reached the upper atmosphere, it reacted with water vapor to form sulfuric acid. Not a little bit, enough to fundamentally alter the chemistry of rainfall across the entire planet. Within decades of the eruptions intensifying, rain became increasingly acidic. In regions downwind of the Siberian traps, rainfall probably achieved pH levels comparable to modern battery acid. Picture what happens when acid rain falls on a forest. The first rains are the worst. Leaves show burn damage within hours. Trees that have stood for centuries start dying from the top down as their foliage is chemically scorched. The acid seeps into soil, leaching out essential nutrients, killing the microorganisms that help plants absorb nutrition. Root systems collapse. Entire forests die standing. Their skeletal remains a testament to air that has turned corrosive. But the sulfur dioxide did something else too, something that sounds contradictory but made everything worse. High in the atmosphere, sulfate aerosols formed from the volcanic emissions. These particles reflected sunlight back into space, causing temporary cooling in some regions even as greenhouse gases were driving long-term warming. This created chaotic weather patterns. Some areas experienced flash freezes followed by intense heat waves. Others saw rainfall patterns collapse entirely as atmospheric circulation patterns broke down. The skies themselves became alien. Ashen aerosols turned daylight into a perpetual twilight in some regions. Sunsets would have been spectacular. Vivid reds and oranges caused by light scattering through particle-laden air. But that beauty masked horror. Photosynthesis rates plummeted in many areas, starving the base of the food chain. Then there was the ozone layer. The volcanic eruptions released massive quantities of chlorine and bromine compounds, gases that rise to the stratosphere and catalytically destroy ozone molecules. Modern scientists estimate that volcanic halogen emissions from the Siberian traps reduce stratospheric ozone by 50% or more in some regions. The planet's protective shield against ultraviolet radiation was being systematically dismantled. When the ash finally cleared from the atmosphere in some regions, the organisms below discovered they'd traded one nightmare for another. Ultraviolet radiation now reached the surface at intensities not seen in hundreds of millions of years. UVB radiation, the type that damages DNA and causes mutations, poured through the weakened ozone layer. Plants that had survived the initial acid rain and temperature spike now faced cellular damage from radiation. Animals developed lesions, cataracts, and immune system failures. Marine organisms in shallow waters were particularly vulnerable, their UV-exposed larvae dying before they could develop protective features, but nature wasn't finished. The warming atmosphere was triggering feedback loops that made everything exponentially worse. As temperatures climbed, the oceans began to warm. Not just the surface, but slowly, inexorably, the heat penetrated deeper into the water column. This warming destabilized something that had been locked safely in the cold, high-pressure environment of the deep ocean floor for millions of years. Methane hydrates. These ice-like compounds form when methane gas is trapped in frozen water under high pressure. They're stable when conditions are right, but they're extremely sensitive to temperature changes. As the oceans warmed, vast deposits of methane hydrate began to melt, releasing their trapped gas into the water and then into the atmosphere. Methane is a greenhouse gas roughly 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over short timescales. The release of even a fraction of the ocean floor's methane reserves would have amplified the warming dramatically, And that's exactly what happened. Evidence from the geological record shows multiple pulses of methane released throughout the extinction event, each one spiking atmospheric methane concentrations and driving temperatures even higher. This created what scientists call a positive feedback loop, though there's nothing positive about it. Warming releases methane, which causes more warming, which releases more methane. The system spirals out of control like a car accelerating downhill with no brakes. Once it starts, it's incredibly difficult to stop. The carbon isotope record from this period tells a story of atmospheric chaos. We can see the signature of volcanic carbon dioxide in the rocks, then pulses of methane release, then more volcanic emissions. Each pulse drove temperatures higher. Each temperature spike caused more ecological collapse, more vegetation die-off, more methane release from dying peatlands and warming permafrost. The atmosphere's composition was fundamentally changing. Before the eruptions began, carbon dioxide concentrations were probably around 400 parts per million, roughly similar to pre-industrial human levels. At the height of the crisis, concentrations may have reached 2,500 parts per million or even higher. The air itself became harder to breathe for some organisms. Not thin, exactly, but chemically different in ways that stressed respiratory systems evolved for a different atmospheric composition. And still the eruptions continued, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The Siberian traps didn't care about the devastation they were causing. They were simply bleeding the Earth's interior, releasing gases that had been locked away since the planet's formation. Volcanic winter, followed by greenhouse summer, followed by acid rain, followed by ozone depletion, followed by methane pulses. Wave after wave of atmospheric assault that nothing alive could fully adapt to. Some organisms tried. There's evidence that some plant species evolved more acid-resistant leaf coatings. Some marine organisms developed enhanced UV protective compounds. Some animals shifted to nocturnal lifestyles to avoid the deadliest radiation during peak daylight hours. But these adaptations took time, generations, and the crisis was moving faster than evolution. The truly horrifying thing is that many of these atmospheric changes reinforced each other in unexpected ways. Acid rain killed vegetation, which meant less carbon dioxide absorption, which meant more greenhouse warming. Warming released methane, which trapped more heat, which killed more vegetation and warmed more ocean floor. Ozone depletion damaged plankton, which disrupted oceanic carbon cycling, which altered atmospheric chemistry further. It was like watching a machine designed specifically to destroy life. Every component made every other component worse. Every feedback loop amplified every other feedback loop. The atmosphere wasn't just becoming hostile, it was becoming systematically lethal in multiple overlapping ways. And throughout all of this, most organisms had no idea what was killing them. A forest die-off could have been the acid rain, or the temperature spike, or the UV radiation, or the disrupted rainfall patterns, or probably all of them together. Marine organisms dying in shallow waters might have been suffocating from low oxygen, or burning from acid, or radiation damaged, or simply unable to feed because their prey had already gone extinct. The complexity of the catastrophe is part of what made it so deadly. There was no single problem to solve, no single adaptation that could save you. The atmosphere itself had become a gauntlet of overlapping threats, each one potentially lethal, all of them operating simultaneously. By the time the worst of the atmospheric disruption began to ease, probably 200,000 to 300,000 years after the eruption started, the damage was incomprehensible. The atmosphere's chemistry would take tens of thousands of years to restabilize. The ozone layer would need millennia to rebuild. The carbon cycle would require millions of years to fully recover. But that was still far in the future. For now, for the organisms trying to survive day by day, breath by breath. The air itself had become an enemy. Every inhale was a gamble. Every moment in sunlight a risk. Every rainfall potentially corrosive. The sky, which had always been neutral, indifferent to the life below it, had turned actively hostile. And there was nowhere to hide from the sky. While the land was burning, something even worse was happening beneath the waves. The oceans, which covered 70% of Earth's surface and contained 99% of all living space on the planet, were turning into a toxic nightmare. This wasn't a quick disaster. This was a slow, systematic poisoning that took thousands of years to unfold. But once it started, there was no stopping it. The first victims were the smallest ones, microscopic organisms with shells made of calcium carbonate, foraminifera, coccolithophores, pteropods, tiny creatures most people have never heard of but which form the absolute foundation of marine food webs. They were dying by the trillions. Here's what was killing them. All that CO2 pouring into the atmosphere from the Siberian traps, it didn't just stay in the air. About a third of it dissolved directly into the ocean surface, and when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. The ocean was becoming acidic. Not like battery acid. Nothing that dramatic. We're talking about subtle changes in pH, but subtle was enough. Those microscopic shell builders relied on chemical reactions that only work within a narrow pH range. They pull calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and combine them to build their protective shells. It's a delicate process, one that evolution had perfected over hundreds of millions of years, but it requires the water to have the right chemistry. When the pH drops, even slightly, the carbonate ions become scarce. Building shells becomes harder, then impossible. Eventually the water becomes so acidic it starts dissolving existing shells. Imagine trying to build a sandcastle while someone keeps throwing water on it. That's what these organisms faced. Except the sandcastle was their body's protective covering, and the water was everywhere, inescapable. Within a few thousand years of the eruption's beginning, shell-building organisms across the world's oceans were struggling. Within 10,000 years, many species were going extinct. The fossil record shows it clearly. Sediment cores from the Permian-Triassic boundary show layers where shell fragments just disappear. Millions of years of accumulated diversity, gone in what amounts to a geological eye blink. But acidification was just the beginning. The oceans had another, even more deadly problem. They were suffocating. Water holds less oxygen when it's warm. It's simple physics. As global temperatures climbed 10, 15, maybe 20 degrees above normal, the oceans heated up. Surface waters warmed fastest, but eventually the heat penetrated deeper, and as they warmed, the oxygen they contained began escaping into the atmosphere. The oceans were literally losing their ability to breathe. For fish, for marine reptiles, for anything that needed oxygen to survive, the water was becoming unlivable. But they couldn't just leave. They were trapped in an environment that was slowly strangling them. The fossil record from coastal regions shows mass death assemblages. Thousands of fish killed simultaneously, their bodies settling into sediment layers that preserve the moment of catastrophe. Some show signs of having clustered near shore in shallower waters where oxygen levels remain slightly higher. They were desperately seeking any refuge they could find. But there was nowhere to go, because the oxygen crisis wasn't uniform. It started at the bottom and worked its way up. Deep ocean waters, already naturally low in oxygen, became completely anoxic. Zero oxygen. And when that happens, something truly horrifying takes over. Bacteria. Not normal bacteria. These were anaerobic, sulfate-reducing bacteria that thrive in oxygen-free environments. They had been living in deep ocean sediments for billions of years, processing organic matter and producing hydrogen sulfide as waste. Hydrogen sulfide, the same chemical that makes rotten eggs smell terrible, except in concentrations thousands of times higher. In small amounts it's just unpleasant. In large amounts it's deadly poison. Under normal conditions, these bacteria stay trapped in the sediments. Any hydrogen sulfide they produce gets oxidized by oxygen in the water above, neutralizing it. But when the deep oceans lost their oxygen, there was nothing to stop the poison from spreading. The hydrogen sulfide began bubbling up from the sediments, creating vast anoxic zones where nothing could survive. These zones expanded upward, rising from the ocean floor toward the surface like an invisible cloud of death. The evidence for this is written in the rock record. Sediments from the Permian-Triassic boundary show biomarkers, molecular fossils left behind by specific types of bacteria, and the signature is unmistakable. Green sulfur bacteria and purple sulfur bacteria, organisms that photosynthesize using hydrogen sulfide instead of water. They only thrive when sulfide levels are extraordinarily high. Finding their biomarkers in Permian-Triassic sediments means the hydrogen sulfide had risen all the way to the sunlit surface layers of the ocean. Think about what that means. The ocean surface, where 90% of marine life exists, had turned into a toxic soup of hydrogen sulfide. The water would have looked wrong, greenish-purple from bacterial blooms instead of the normal blue. It would have smelled like hell itself, the stench of billions of tons of hydrogen sulfide escaping into the atmosphere. And nothing that breathed oxygen could survive in it. These sulfide zones weren't everywhere at first. They started in the deep ocean basins, in areas where circulation was naturally restricted. But as the climate continued warming and ocean oxygen levels continued dropping, these dead zones expanded. They merged, spread across continental shelves, invaded coastal waters. Within perhaps 20,000 years of the eruption's beginning, vast areas of the ocean had become completely lifeless. And here's where the ocean's normal defenses failed. Under normal circumstances, ocean circulation acts like a planetary life support system. Cold, oxygen-rich water sinks at the poles and flows along the ocean floor toward the equator. Meanwhile, warm surface water flows toward the poles to replace it. This circulation, called thermohaline circulation, or the global conveyor belt, constantly refreshes the deep ocean with oxygen. But the Great Dying broke this system, broke this. As temperatures rose, the temperature difference between polar and equatorial waters decreased. The circulation slowed, then in some regions stopped entirely. The ocean became stratified, with warm, low-oxygen water sitting on top of cold, anoxic water. There was no mixing, no refreshment. The deep ocean became a stagnant pool, perfect conditions for hydrogen sulfide production to accelerate. Marine food webs collapsed from the bottom up. First the microscopic shell builders died, victims of acidification. Then the zooplankton that fed on them starved. Then the small fish that fed on zooplankton. Then the larger predators. Each extinction triggered more extinctions, cascading through the ecosystem faster than evolution could respond. The Great Permian reef systems were among the most spectacular casualties. These weren't coral reefs like we have today. Corals existed in the Permian, but the massive reef structures were built primarily by different organisms. Sponges, bryozoans, and strange extinct creatures called rugose and tabulate corals that aren't closely related to modern reef corals. They had been building reefs for hundreds of millions of years, creating vast limestone structures that provided habitat for thousands of other species. These reefs were dying. The organisms that built them needed clear, well-oxygenated water with stable chemistry. They were getting the opposite. Acidic, oxygen-poor water filled with toxic hydrogen sulfide. The reef builders stopped growing, then began dying. Once thriving reefs that had stood for millions of years began disintegrating. The organisms that lived among the reefs, the fish, the mollusks, the arthropods, all lost their homes. Many had nowhere else to go. They were specialists, evolved specifically to live in reef environments. Paleontologists have mapped the death of these reef systems in exquisite detail. You can trace it in the fossil record, layer by layer. The lowest layers show thriving, diverse reef communities. Move up a few meters, representing thousands of years, and diversity starts dropping. Species disappear one by one. Move up further and the reef structure itself begins breaking down. The uppermost layers from the extinction interval show no reef at all, just rubble and mud, a grave marker for ecosystems that had existed since the Cambrian. The scale of death was incomprehensible. Modern estimates suggest that 96% of all marine species went extinct. Not 96% of individuals, 96% of species. Entire orders and families wiped out completely. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods that had survived every previous mass extinction for 270 million years, disappeared forever. Eurypterids, the massive sea scorpions that had been apex predators for hundreds of millions of years, gone. Blastoids, crinoids, brachiopods, all suffered extinction rates above 90%. But some numbers hide as much as they reveal. When we say 96% of marine species went extinct, we're talking about species we can identify from fossils, things with shells or bones or hard parts that preserve. The actual death toll was certainly higher. Soft-bodied organisms, jellyfish, worms, many types of larvae and microscopic creatures, they leave almost no fossil record. How many of them died? We'll never know, but given that they were living in the same poisoned, oxygen-starved waters as everything else, the extinction rate must have been at least as high, probably higher. And the survivors weren't randomly distributed. They weren't the strongest or the fiercest. They were the lucky ones. Species that happened to have adaptations that let them tolerate low oxygen, or variable chemistry, or toxic conditions. Species with wide geographic ranges that could find refuge in whatever scattered pockets of livable water remained. Species with rapid reproduction rates that could bounce back quickly when conditions improved. Some survived in freshwater refuges. Rivers and lakes were affected too, but less severely than the oceans. The water chemistry in freshwater systems is more buffered against acidification. And some freshwater environments, particularly cold, fast-flowing streams, maintained decent oxygen levels even as the oceans suffocated. Species that could tolerate or invade freshwater had better odds. Others survived in the deep ocean itself, in scattered pockets where local conditions remained barely tolerable. Maybe areas where cold currents still brought occasional oxygen. Maybe regions where upwelling brought nutrients without bringing lethal hydrogen sulfide. These refugees were temporary and probably shifted location as conditions changed. But they were enough, just barely enough. The ocean took the longest to recover. Long after the land had begun healing, long after terrestrial ecosystems had started rebuilding, the oceans remained biological deserts. It would take 5 million years before reef systems began reappearing, 10 million years before marine biodiversity approached pre-extinction levels. The hydrogen sulfide had to dissipate, ocean circulation had to restart, oxygen levels had to climb back to normal. All of this happened slowly, on geological timescales that make human lifespans seem like nothing. But eventually, life did return to the seas. New species evolved to fill empty niches. New reef builders appeared, different from the ones that had died but equally capable. The ocean, poisoned and suffocated, eventually became blue again. But it would never be the same. The Permian Ocean, with its ancient reef systems and its trilobites, and its unique evolutionary experiments, was gone forever. What came after was something new, the beginning of the modern ocean, built on the ashes of the old. While the oceans were choking and dying, the land was burning, not metaphorically, literally burning on a scale that makes modern wildfires look like campfires. We know this because of what geologists find in rock formations from this period. Charcoal. Lots and lots of charcoal. When you dig into sedimentary layers from 252 million years ago, you find thick bands of fossilized charcoal deposits. These aren't scattered remnants of occasional fires. They're continuous layers spanning entire continents. Evidence that massive portions of Earth's forests were simultaneously engulfed in flames. Picture it. You're standing in what should be a lush Permian forest. Towering tree ferns reaching 30-40 feet high. Thick undergrowth of primitive seed plants, the air humid and heavy with the smell of vegetation. But something's wrong. The plants around you are stressed, leaves turning brown at the edges, growth stunted. The soil beneath your feet is cracking from drought. It hasn't rained properly in months, maybe years. The atmospheric oxygen content is still high, around 30% compared to today's 21%. This makes everything more flammable. A spark that would fizzle out in a modern forest becomes an inferno in this oxygen-rich environment. Then the lightning strikes. In a normal year, the forest might be damp enough to resist ignition. But these aren't normal years. The climate crisis has created drought conditions across vast regions. The vegetation is tinder dry. The fire spreads faster than any animal can run. Within hours, hundreds of square miles are ablaze. Within days, thousands. The fires create their own weather systems, generating winds that spread embers dozens of miles ahead of the main blaze. New fires ignite. The separate blazes merge into firestorms that consume everything in their path. And there's nobody to put them out. No rain comes. The drought continues. The fires burn until they run out of fuel or hit natural barriers like rivers or rocky terrain. Then they smoulder for weeks, sending up columns of smoke that darken the skies and add even more greenhouse gases to an already catastrophically overloaded atmosphere. The charcoal layers tell us this happened repeatedly. Not just one catastrophic fire season, but multiple episodes spanning thousands of years. Every time the forests tried to recover, another wave of fires would sweep through and destroy the new growth. It was an ecological death spiral. Fires releasing carbon, carbon heating the planet, heat drying out vegetation, dry vegetation burning more easily, round and round, getting worse with each cycle. But the fires were just the beginning of what happened to terrestrial ecosystems. As the climate continued to deteriorate, plants began dying even without fire. The extreme heat was part of it. Temperatures in equatorial regions probably exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit during the hottest periods. That's hot enough to denature the proteins inside plant cells, hot enough to literally cook vegetation where it stood. The acid rain was devastating too. Remember all that sulfur dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere by the Siberian traps? When it mixed with water vapor, it created sulfuric acid. Rainfall became corrosive, literally acidic enough to damage plant tissues, strip nutrients from soil, and poison the groundwater that plants depended on. Then there was the UV radiation. The atmospheric chemistry changes that were making the oceans anoxic also damaged the ozone layer. Without that protective shield, lethal levels of ultraviolet radiation reach the surface. Plants have some defenses against UV damage, but only up to a point. Prolonged exposure kills plant cells, destroys chlorophyll, prevents photosynthesis. One by one, plant species began going extinct. Not all at once, but in waves. The most sensitive species died first, then the moderately tolerant ones. Eventually, even the hardiest, most adaptable plants couldn't cope with the combination of heat, drought, acid rain, and UV radiation. As the plants died, the consequences cascaded through entire ecosystems. Without vegetation, there was nothing to hold the soil in place. Rainfall, when it did come, washed away topsoil that had taken thousands of years to develop. Rivers turned muddy brown, clogged with sediment. Erosion carved deep gullies across the landscape. What had been fertile valleys became rocky wastelands. Deserts spread like infections. Regions that had been forested for millions of years transformed into barren dunes within a few thousand years. The geological record shows this happening simultaneously across multiple continents. Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, all developing vast desert regions that hadn't existed before. And here's where the evidence gets really eerie. In rock formations from this period, geologists find something called the fungal spike. It's exactly what it sounds like. Sudden, massive increases in fossilized fungal spores, far more than you'd ever find in a normal healthy ecosystem. Fungi are decomposers. They break down dead organic matter. In a balanced ecosystem, you find some fungal spores, but not huge quantities, because there's not that much dead stuff lying around. Living plants and animals dominate the landscape. But in rock layers from the extinction event, fungal spores become the dominant fossil type. More common than plant pollen, more common than everything. This tells us something horrifying. The land wasn't just struggling, it was covered in death. Forests dying and rotting where they stood. Dead animals everywhere. The entire terrestrial biosphere collapsing into a planetary morgue with fungi feasting on the remains. Think about what that means for a moment. An ecosystem so thoroughly destroyed that decomposers became the most successful organisms. The fungi weren't thriving because conditions were good for them. They were thriving because there was just so much death to feed on. It's the biological equivalent of undertakers becoming the richest people in town because everyone's dying. For the animals living through this nightmare, survival became nearly impossible. The dominant land animals of the Permian were the synapsids. These were the ancestors of modern mammals, though they didn't look much like mammals yet. Some were huge, tank-like herbivores the size of modern hippos. Others were fierce predators with massive skulls and saber-like teeth. They had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for tens of millions of years, but they were completely unprepared for what was happening. Herbivorous synapsids depended on plant life that was now dying or dead. Without vegetation, they starved. Their populations crashed first, disappearing from the fossil record within a few thousand years of the extinction event's peak. The carnivores lasted slightly longer, feeding on the dying herbivores and on each other. But as their prey disappeared, they went too. Some of the last synapsid fossils we find show evidence of malnutrition, stress, and disease. These weren't healthy animals. These were desperate creatures clinging to life in a dying world. The heat itself was lethal for many species. Synapsids were probably warm-blooded or at least approaching it, which meant they generated their own body heat. This is great in cool climates, but becomes a liability when environmental temperatures approach your internal body temperature. You can't cool down. There's no thermal gradient to drive heat dissipation. Animals would have suffered from heat stroke, organ failure, death. The smaller creatures faced different but equally severe challenges. Insects, which had been incredibly diverse during the Permian, experienced massive die-offs. Many insect species depend on specific plant species for food. When those plants went extinct, so did the insects. Flying insects probably did better than ground dwellers, because they could move long distances searching for surviving plant populations. But even they faced extinction rates above 50%. Amphibians, which still played important roles in Permian ecosystems, were devastated. They need water for reproduction and have permeable skin that makes them vulnerable to environmental toxins. As water sources dried up and the remaining water became acidic and polluted, amphibian populations collapsed. Some species that had existed for millions of years vanished within a single generation. Even the reptiles, which we might expect to handle heat better, struggled terribly. Yes, they were cold-blooded and adapted to warm climates, but there's a difference between warm and lethal. When temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, when there's no shade because all the trees are dead, when there's no food because all the plants and herbivores are gone, even hardy reptilian survivors couldn't persist. The fossil record from this period shows what paleontologists call the dead zone, a geological interval of perhaps 100,000 years when vertebrate fossils become extraordinarily rare, not absent entirely, but so uncommon that finding one is remarkable. This represents a time when land ecosystems had essentially ceased functioning. The complex food webs that had existed for millions of years had collapsed into something barely recognizable as an ecosystem at all. What did exist? Probably scattered pockets of extremely hardy plants, primitive mosses and lichens clinging to life in areas with slightly better conditions, maybe some ferns in protected valleys where water still flowed, but nothing like a forest, nothing like the lush vegetation that had covered the continents before. The survivors would have been specialists in enduring the unendurable, small burrowing animals that could escape surface heat by living underground, creatures with low metabolic rates that could survive on minimal food, species adapted to desert conditions that could extract moisture from their food rather than needing standing water. But even these survivors weren't thriving. They were barely hanging on. Population sizes would have been tiny, maybe just a few thousand individuals of each species scattered across entire continents. Genetic diversity plummeting as populations went through repeated bottlenecks. Local extinctions happening constantly, with only occasional successful recolonization maintaining species at the continental scale. The landscape itself became alien. Where once there had been forests teeming with life, now there were badlands of eroding rock and shifting sand. Where rivers had meandered through vegetated valleys, now flash floods carved unstable channels that changed course with every storm. The land surface became unstable, dynamic, hostile to complex life. This went on for longer than most species could tolerate. Tens of thousands of years when conditions didn't improve, just fluctuated between terrible and catastrophic. Some years slightly cooler, allowing brief vegetation growth. Then volcanic pulses from Siberia would inject fresh carbon and sulfur into the atmosphere, and conditions would deteriorate again. By the time the worst was over, about 70% of land vertebrate families had disappeared forever. Entire lineages that had been evolving for hundreds of millions of years simply ended. The dominant synapsids, gone. Most large reptiles, gone. Countless invertebrate species, gone. The terrestrial biosphere had been simplified, reduced to a shadow of its former complexity. But here's what makes this story bearable. Life didn't give up. Even in the dead zones, even when almost nothing could survive, a few species persisted. Small, adaptable, tough enough to endure until conditions finally began to improve. They were about to inherit a devastated world with almost no competition. The survivors of the land crisis were positioned to do something extraordinary. But first, they had to make it through just a little longer. The worst was ending. The long, slow recovery was about to begin. When 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates disappeared, the world should have been empty, silent, dead. But it wasn't. Because life, even when pushed to the absolute brink, has a stubborn refusal to quit completely. Picture the landscape 251 million years ago, just after the dying stopped. You're standing in what used to be a lush forest. Now it's a wasteland. The soil is thin, acidic, barely clinging to the rocks. The sky is still hazy with volcanic ash. though the worst of the eruptions have finally ceased. The temperature is beginning to stabilize, though stable now means brutally hot and dry across most of the planet. And in this devastation, something moves. It's about the size of a pig, but it's not a mammal. Not exactly. This creature has a barrel-shaped body, stumpy legs, and a turtle-like beak. It's digging, scratching at the barren earth, searching for roots, anything edible that might have survived underground. This is Lystrosaurus, and for the next several million years, it will be the most common vertebrate on Earth. Not just common, dominant. In some fossil beds from the early Triassic, Lystrosaurus skeletons make up 95% of all vertebrate fossils. 95%. Imagine if 95 out of every 100 animals you encountered were the exact same species. That's how thoroughly Lystrosaurus inherited the empty earth. But why Lystrosaurus? What made this particular creature special enough to survive when nearly everything else died? The answer lies in its lifestyle. Lystrosaurus was a burrower, not occasionally, not just for shelter, but as a fundamental part of its survival strategy. It dug extensive burrow systems, sometimes going several meters underground. And during the extinction event, when the surface world became hell, those burrows became life-saving refuges. Underground, temperatures remained more stable, the air was less toxic. During the worst ashfalls, Lystrosaurus could simply retreat into its tunnels and wait out the storm. But burrowing alone wasn't enough. Lystrosaurus also had another critical advantage. It could eat almost anything plant-based. That turtle-like beak was perfect for cropping tough vegetation, digging up roots, even processing woody stems that most herbivores couldn't digest. In the devastated post-extinction world, where plant diversity had collapsed and most vegetation was hardy, opportunistic species like ferns and horsetails, this dietary flexibility was everything. Size mattered too. Lystrosaurus wasn't huge, medium-sized, big enough to be efficient to store fat reserves that could carry it through lean times, but small enough that it didn't need massive amounts of food to survive. In the aftermath of the extinction, when food was scarce and unpredictable, being modestly sized was a tremendous advantage. And there was something else. Something written in Lystrosaurus fossils that tells us about its final survival trick. Growth rings in their bones show they grew slowly, taking several years to reach maturity. This suggests they lived longer than many other therapsids. Longer. Lifespans meant more opportunities to reproduce over time, more chances to weather bad years and capitalize on good ones. It's the tortoise versus hare strategy, except the hares were all dead. Within a few 100,000 years of the extinction, Lystrosaurus had spread across virtually every landmass on Earth. Fossils show up in Antarctica, Africa, India, Russia, China. This was a global success story, a single genus exploiting the devastated ecosystems left behind by the greatest mass death in history. Biologists call species like this disaster taxa, organisms that are specifically adapted to thrive in the chaotic, impoverished conditions immediately following catastrophic environmental change. They're opportunist, generalist survivors. They inherit the Earth not because they're the most sophisticated or specialized, but because they're the most adaptable when everything else fails. But Lystrosaurus wasn't alone. Other survivors clung to existence in the margins, each with its own set of catastrophe-beating adaptations. In the oceans, the survivors told a different story. The extinction had been even more severe in marine environments where 96% of species vanished. But that remaining 4% carried life forward. Small bivalves, clams and oysters with hard shells that could seal tight, protecting them from reacidified water. They buried themselves in seafloor sediments where conditions were slightly less lethal. Some species could shut down their metabolism almost entirely, entering a kind of living stasis until conditions improved. Certain fish survived by moving, not just swimming around randomly, but systematically seeking out refugia, isolated pockets where conditions remained tolerable. Deep ocean vents, where volcanic heat and minerals created local oases of survivable chemistry. Brackish estuaries where fresh water mixing with seawater diluted the worst of the acidity. Polar regions where cooler temperatures meant less severe oxygen depletion. These refugia were tiny compared to the vast dead zones that covered most of the ocean. But they were enough. Like biological life rafts, they kept marine ecosystems from collapsing completely. Species that found these refuges could survive, reproduce slowly, and eventually spread back out when conditions improved. The fossil record from these refugia is sparse, fragmentary, but genetic analysis of modern marine organisms reveals the signature of these population bottlenecks. Modern fish, mollusks, and crustaceans all trace their lineages back to tiny populations that survived in isolated pockets during the Great Dying. We are all, every ocean creature alive today, descendants of refugia survivors. On land, plants faced their own existential crisis. The extinction had wiped out vast swathes of forest ecosystems. The elaborate seed ferns and conifers that had dominated for millions of years collapsed. But some plants survived, and their strategy was radically different from the animals. Ferns exploded, not immediately, but within a few thousand years of the extinction's peak. Fern spores preserved in rocks from this period show a massive spike, sometimes making up 80–90% of all plant fossils. This phenomenon, called the fern spike, appears in rock layers all over the world, a global marker of ecological collapse and opportunistic recovery. Why ferns? Because ferns reproduce through spores, not seeds. Spores are tiny, produced by the millions, capable of dispersing across vast distances on the wind. They can lie dormant in soil for years, waiting for favourable conditions. And when those conditions arrive, ferns can colonize barren ground incredibly quickly, creating dense carpets of vegetation within a single growing season. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, the world was covered in bare rock and thin soil, landscapes that favoured fast-growing colonizers over slow-growing specialists. Ferns were perfect for this role. They established themselves first, creating initial soil stability and organic matter. They were the pioneer species, the first wave of recovery, preparing the ground for the trees and shrubs that would follow millions of years later. But even among ferns, not all species survived equally. The ones that made it tended to be small, with simple leaves and minimal water requirements. They could grow in marginal conditions, on bare rock, in thin alkaline soils that would kill most plants. They were the botanical equivalent of disaster taxa, specialized for catastrophe recovery. And then there were the insects. Insects are incredibly hard to study from this time period because they rarely fossilize. Their exoskeletons are too fragile, their bodies too small, but the evidence we do have suggests that insects survived the Great Dying better than most other groups, though they still suffered massive losses. Part of their success came from their life cycles. Many insects can go from egg to adult in weeks or months, not years. This rapid reproduction meant they could adapt to changing conditions quickly, evolving new survival strategies across dozens of generations while larger animals were still struggling through their first post-catastrophe breeding season. Size helped too. Small bodies meant small food requirements. An insect could survive on resources that wouldn't sustain a mouse, let alone a Lystrosaurus. And insects had already evolved to exploit every conceivable ecological niche. Some ate dead plant matter, which was suddenly abundant as forests died. Others were predators or parasites, feeding on the few surviving animals. Some even ate minerals directly, scraping nutrients from rocks and volcanic ash. Their diversity of survival strategies meant that even as some insect groups went extinct, others filled the gaps rapidly. Within a few million years, insects had not only recovered but diversified into new forms that would eventually give rise to all modern insect groups. But here's what's truly remarkable about all these survivors. They weren't the dominant species before the extinction. Lystrosaurus existed before the Great Dying, but it was relatively uncommon, overshadowed by larger, more specialized therapsids and early reptiles. Ferns were around, but they were subordinate to seed ferns and conifers. Small burrowing animals existed, but they lived in the shadows of giant predators and mega herbivores. The extinction didn't favor the best or the strongest. It favored the adaptable, the small, the generalists who could survive on scraps when the abundance disappeared. It rewarded being unspecialized at a time when environmental conditions changed faster than specialists could adapt. This created ecosystems that looked absolutely nothing like what came before. Imagine standing in the early Triassic, 5 million years after the extinction. You're surrounded by Lystrosaurus everywhere you look. They're digging in the dirt, chomping on ferns, occasionally fighting over burrows. The plant life is monotonous, mostly ferns and simple horsetails, nothing taller than your waist. The soil is thin, reddish, oxidized. There are almost no trees, no forests, just endless scrubby plains. The rivers run thick with sediment because there's not enough vegetation to hold the soil in place. In the distance, you might spot another survivor, maybe a small archosaur, the distant ancestor of dinosaurs and crocodiles, scavenging or hunting for insects. But mostly it's just Lystrosaurus. Millions of them, inheriting an Earth that had become almost unrecognizable. This is what biologists call an impoverished ecosystem. Not dead, but drastically simplified. Where pre-extinction ecosystems might have contained hundreds of species in complex food webs, early Triassic ecosystems often had fewer than a dozen common vertebrate species. Entire ecological roles were empty. Top predators were rare or absent. Large herbivores were replaced by endless medium-sized generalists. Specialized niches simply didn't exist yet because the environments were too unstable to support specialization. And this impoverishment lasted. Not for centuries, not for millennia, but for millions of years. It took roughly 10 million years before ecosystems regained anywhere close to their pre-extinction complexity. 10 million years of living on a planet dominated by disaster taxa and opportunistic colonizers. But through it all, life held on. That's the profound message written in these rocks and fossils. Life hung on by the thinnest possible thread, a few burrowing animals, some flexible fish in isolated refugia, hardy ferns whose ancestors' spores happened to survive, insects small enough to slip through the catastrophe. If any one of these groups had failed, if Lystrosaurus hadn't been able to burrow, if ferns hadn't been able to colonize bare ground, if those marine refugia had been just slightly more toxic, the thread might have broken completely. But it didn't. Life persisted. Not thriving, not diverse, not complex, but alive. And that was enough. Because given time, even the most impoverished ecosystem can rebuild. Given millions of years, disaster taxa give way to specialists. Simple food webs become complex. Empty niches fill with new species evolve from whatever survived. The survivors of the Great Dying weren't special because they were superior. They were special because they were there, because they possessed just the right combination of traits to endure the unsurvivable. And from those survivors, from that thin thread of persistent life, everything that came after would emerge, including, eventually, us. The Great Dying ended, but the world didn't just bounce back. It didn't heal in a few thousand years, or even a few 100,000. The recovery from the Permian-Triassic extinction took 10 million years. 10 million years before Earth's ecosystems resembled anything close to the complexity that had existed before. To put that in perspective, 10 million years ago, your ancestors were still tree-dwelling apes. Humans wouldn't exist for another 9.5 million years. The pyramids of Egypt, ancient beyond our comprehension, would still be 9,990,000 years in the future. That's how long it took for life to truly recover from the Great Dying. Why so long? Why couldn't Earth just restart, repopulate, move on? The answer is that the Great Dying didn't just kill things and then stop. It created a cascade of environmental crises that kept hitting the planet, again and again, like aftershocks from a massive earthquake. Except these aftershocks lasted for millions of years. The Siberian traps kept erupting on and off for at least another million years after the main extinction event. Every time ecosystems started to stabilize, another pulse of volcanic activity would flood the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and toxic gases. Ocean acidification would spike again, temperatures would climb higher, and whatever fragile recovery had begun would collapse. This happened at least 5 times in the first million years after the Great Dying. 5 separate extinction pulses, each one wiping out species that had just barely managed to establish themselves. Life was trying to climb out of a hole, but the ground kept giving way beneath it. Then there was the oxygen problem. Remember, ocean anoxia had spread across most of the seafloor during the extinction. That didn't just disappear overnight. The deep oceans remained oxygen-starved for millions of years, creating what geologists call a delayed recovery scenario. New species would evolve in the shallow coastal waters, start to diversify, begin expanding into deeper environments. Then they'd hit the anoxic zones and die. The deep ocean became a graveyard that nothing could colonize, a vast empty space that should have been full of life, but remained stubbornly dead. This cut Earth's usable marine habitat by more than half, like trying to repopulate a city when 3/4 of the buildings are still filled with poison gas. On land, the situation was somehow even worse. The forests were gone, not just reduced, not just damaged, gone. Across vast regions of the planet there were no trees, just scrubland, ferns and fungi spreading across landscapes that had once been dominated by towering forests. And they didn't come back, not for millions of years. Geologists call this the coal gap. Coal forms from fossilized plant material, mostly trees, that gets buried in swamps and compressed over millions of years. In rock layers from the late Permian, right before the extinction, there's coal everywhere, evidence of massive forests covering the continents. Then the Great Dying happens, and the coal disappears from the geological record. For nearly 10 million years, there's almost no coal forming anywhere on Earth. This tells us something profound and disturbing. The forest didn't just die. The conditions that allowed forests to exist had been fundamentally disrupted. Part of the problem was the soil. Forests need soil, deep, rich soil full of nutrients and organic matter. But when all the plants died during the Great Dying, there was nothing to hold the soil in place. Massive erosion stripped away millions of years of soil development, washing it into the oceans in muddy floods. What was left was basically dirt. Mineral substrate with almost no organic content, no nutrients, no structure. Nothing could grow in it, not properly. The few plants that did manage to colonize these barren landscapes were pioneers, hardy species adapted to terrible conditions, mostly ferns and lycophytes, primitive plants that could tolerate poor soil and unstable conditions. They formed low, scrubby vegetation, nothing like the diverse forest ecosystems that had existed before, and they stayed that way for millions of years, slowly, incrementally building up the organic matter needed for real soil to develop again. Meanwhile, The absence of forests created another problem. Without trees to stabilize the climate through transpiration and carbon cycling, weather patterns became chaotic. Some regions experienced savage droughts that lasted for centuries. Others were hammered by monsoons of unprecedented intensity. The early Triassic climate was violently unstable, swinging between extremes in ways that made it nearly impossible for complex ecosystems to establish themselves. Any species that adapted to wet conditions would be wiped out when a mega drought hit. Any species that adapted to dry conditions would drown when the rains returned. Only the most generalist, most adaptable species could survive, and these were usually simple organisms that reproduced quickly and could colonize new areas fast when conditions briefly improved. In the oceans, the recovery followed a strange and halting pattern. The first animals to bounce back were the disaster species, opportunistic organisms that thrive in disturbed environments. Tiny shellfish called bivalves spread across the seafloor in enormous numbers, forming dense mats in shallow waters. But they were all the same few species repeated endlessly. No diversity, no complexity, just vast monocultures of survival specialists. The reefs, those incredible underwater cities that had dominated Permian oceans, stayed dead longest. The reef-building organisms that had created them, complex sponges and corals, had been completely wiped out. For millions of years there were no reefs anywhere on Earth. The shallow tropical seas that should have been rainbow-coloured coral gardens were empty expanses of muddy bottom and scattered rocks. Then, slowly, new reef builders emerged. Not the same species that had built the Permian reefs, those were extinct forever, but new organisms that evolved to fill the empty niche. First came calcifying algae, primitive plants that secreted calcium carbonate skeletons. They formed small reef-like structures in the shallowest, warmest waters. Then came new types of sponges, descendants of the few species that had survived the Great Dying. They learned to build calcium frameworks, creating small patch reefs in sheltered lagoons. Finally, millions of years after the extinction, true corals appeared. These were different from the Permian corals, a completely new lineage that had evolved from sea anemones that had survived the catastrophe. They started small, forming tiny colonies in favourable locations, but they had hit upon a winning strategy, partnership with photosynthetic algae that lived in their tissues, providing them with energy from sunlight. This symbiosis, which still powers coral reefs today, allowed them to grow faster and larger than any previous reef builder. By the Middle Triassic, about 8 million years after the Great Dying, coral reefs were finally returning to Earth's oceans. They would go on to dominate marine ecosystems for the next 250 million years, right up to the present day. But the most dramatic changes were happening on land, in the empty spaces left by the extinction. The dominant land animals of the Permian had been the therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles with their upright postures and possibly warm blood. Many therapsid lineages had gone extinct during the Great Dying, but a few survived. For the first few million years of the Triassic, they remained the dominant large animals on land, the top predators and herbivores. But they were living on borrowed time. A new group was emerging, one that would change the history of life on Earth forever, the archosaurs. Archosaurs were a relatively minor group in the Permian, small reptiles that hadn't amounted to much, but they had certain advantages. Their legs were positioned directly under their bodies, more efficient for running than the sprawling limbs of most reptiles. Their skulls had extra openings that allowed for stronger jaw muscles, and crucially, they had more efficient lungs than other reptiles, a major advantage in the low oxygen conditions of the early Triassic. While the therapsids struggled in the oxygen-depleted air, the archosaurs thrived. They began diversifying rapidly, filling empty niches across the continents. Some became swift predators, chasing down prey on long legs. Others became heavily armoured herbivores, capable of processing the tough primitive vegetation that dominated early Triassic landscapes. A few even returned to the water, becoming the ancestors of crocodilians. By the Middle Triassic, archosaurs had largely displaced the therapsids as the dominant land animals. The therapsids didn't go extinct entirely. Some lineages survived, and one of them would eventually evolve into true mammals tens of millions of years later. But they were no longer in charge. The age of the mammal-like reptiles was over. The age of the archosaurs, the age that would culminate in the dinosaurs, had begun. This was a fundamental reshaping of terrestrial ecosystems. It happened because the Great Dying had created empty space, eliminated the established dominant groups, and given new lineages room to experiment and diversify. Without the extinction, archosaurs might have remained minor players forever. Dinosaurs might never have evolved. The entire history of life on Earth would have been different. And that diversification accelerated as the 10 million year recovery period progressed. By the late Triassic, about 15 million years after the Great Dying, Earth was starting to look alive again. The forests were returning, not the same forests as before, but new assemblages dominated by conifers and ferns. Coal was forming again in the geological record. Ocean diversity was climbing back toward pre-extinction levels. Coral reefs were spreading through tropical seas, and on land the archosaurs were radiating into an astonishing array of forms. Some were tiny, barely larger than chickens. Others were massive, multi-ton beasts that shook the ground when they walked. The first dinosaurs appeared during this period, small bipedal predators that didn't look particularly impressive at the time, just another archosaur lineage among many. But they would have their day. By 200 million years ago, Earth had finally recovered from the Great Dying. Biodiversity had climbed back to something approaching Permian levels. Ecosystems were complex again, with multiple trophic levels and intricate food webs. The planet was full of life once more. But it wasn't the same planet it had been before. Almost nothing from the Permian had survived. The species were all new, evolved from the tiny fraction of life that had made it through the catastrophe. The dominant groups were different. The ecosystems were structured differently. Even the fundamental rules of evolution had changed, shaped by 10 million years of recovery in a damaged world. The Great Dying had been a hard reset, a catastrophic interruption that had cleared the board and forced life to start over almost from scratch, and in that terrible purging and slow rebuilding, the future had been decided. The dinosaurs would rise because the mammal-like reptiles had fallen. Mammals would remain small because the archosaurs dominated large body sizes. The modern world, our world, would eventually emerge from the ashes of the Permian, but it would take another 250 million years and several more mass extinctions to get there. Sometimes, when everything dies, what grows back is nothing like what came before. Sometimes catastrophe doesn't just interrupt history, it rewrites it completely. The 10 million years of healing after the Great Dying taught life a lesson it has never forgotten. Survival isn't guaranteed. Dominance is temporary. And when the world ends, only the most adaptable, most resilient, most relentlessly persistent forms of life will have any chance at all of seeing what comes next. So here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because everything we've been talking about, this ancient catastrophe that happened 252 million years ago, it's not just history. It's a warning written in stone, carved into layers of rock by processes so violent they nearly ended life itself. And we're only beginning to learn how to read it. The scientists who study the Great Dying aren't just interested in what happened. They're terrified by how familiar parts of it look. Let me show you what I mean. In the rocks from the extinction boundary, geochemists find evidence of massive carbon dioxide release. Not a little bit, not a gradual increase. We're talking about enough CO2 to raise atmospheric concentrations by thousands of parts per million. Enough to push global temperatures up by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, maybe more. The Siberian traps erupted for roughly 2 million years, pumping out an estimated 100,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. For comparison, humans have released about 1,500 gigatons since the Industrial Revolution. Sounds like we're not even close, right? But here's the thing that keeps climate scientists up at night. We're releasing our carbon about 10 times faster than those volcanoes did. Speed matters. The Permian extinction happened over tens of thousands of years, maybe a few 100,000 if you count all the aftershocks. That gave some species time to migrate, to adapt, to find refuges. We're compressing a similar amount of atmospheric change into centuries instead of millennia. Evolution doesn't work that fast. Adaptation doesn't happen on human timescales. When you compress geological processes into historical timeframes, you don't get gradual change. You get catastrophe. The parallels go deeper. Ocean acidification in the Permian world was brutal. All that CO2 dissolving into seawater, forming carbonic acid, dropping pH levels until shell-forming organisms literally couldn't build their protective armor anymore. Paleontologists find layer after layer of seafloor from this period, where carbonate shells just stop appearing. Not because the animals stopped dying, but because their shells dissolved before they could fossilize. The ocean was eating its own dead. Today, we're running the same experiment. Ocean pH has dropped 0.1 units since pre-industrial times. That might sound small, but pH is a logarithmic scale. We're talking about a 30% increase in ocean acidity. Coral reefs are bleaching. Shellfish are struggling. Pteropods, tiny swimming snails that form the base of many ocean food webs, are finding their shells dissolving in increasingly acidic waters. We haven't reached Permian levels yet, not even close, but we're heading in that direction at a pace that would have seemed impossible to the ancient world. Then there's ocean deoxygenation. The Permian seas turn stagnant, their oxygen depleted by warming waters and algae blooms. Purple sulfur bacteria spread across the continental shelves, poisoning the shallows with hydrogen sulfide. Today, oceanographers are documenting expanding dead zones in coastal waters worldwide. The oxygen minimum zones in the deep ocean are growing. It's not catastrophic yet, not even remotely comparable to what happened 252 million years ago. But the mechanisms are identical. Warm water holds less oxygen. Nutrient pollution feeds algae blooms. Stratification prevents oxygen from reaching the depths. We're seeing the early chapters of a book we've read before, and we know how it ends. But here's what makes the Great Dying both terrifying and oddly hopeful. Scientists can study it. They can read the rocks like a textbook, learning lessons that might help us avoid writing our own extinction chapter. The research is painstaking. Geologists trek to remote locations in China, South Africa, Greenland, Antarctica, places where rocks from the Permian-Triassic boundary are exposed. They collect samples centimetre by centimetre, building detailed records of how the crisis unfolded. Each layer represents hundreds or thousands of years. Each chemical signature tells part of the story. They measure carbon isotopes to track how the carbon cycle collapsed. They analyze sulfur isotopes to understand how ocean chemistry changed. They count pollen grains to document how plant communities died and recovered. They examine rock textures to determine ocean oxygen levels. It's detective work on a geological scale, piecing together evidence from a crime scene that's 252 million years old. And they argue. Oh, do they argue? The scientific debates about the Great Dying are ongoing and heated. Was the extinction caused primarily by direct volcanic effects, gas poisoning, and acid rain? Or was climate change the main killer? How important was ocean anoxia versus ocean acidification? Did methane release from the seafloor amplify the crisis? Some researchers think the Siberian traps alone can explain everything. Others argue there must have been additional factors, maybe an asteroid impact, though evidence is limited. Still others think the extinction happened in multiple pulses, with different causes dominating at different times. This uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's how science works. Each hypothesis gets tested against the evidence. New techniques reveal new data. Old assumptions get overturned. Gradually, the picture becomes clearer, more nuanced, more complete. Recent research has focused on the speed of various kill mechanisms. How fast did ocean acidification develop? How quickly did oxygen levels drop? The answers matter because they tell us how rapidly ecosystems can collapse once you push them past certain thresholds. Some studies suggest parts of the extinction happened catastrophically fast, possibly within a few thousand years. That's geological eye blink. It means that once the system reached a tipping point, the collapse was essentially unstoppable. Other research examines the recovery, trying to understand why it took so long. 10 million years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Why couldn't life bounce back faster? The answers seem to involve feedback loops. Damaged ecosystems couldn't regulate climate effectively. Depleted soil couldn't support diverse plant communities. Simplified food webs were vulnerable to additional shocks. Every time life tried to recover, some new crisis would knock it back down. This might be the most important lesson from the deep past. Resilience has limits. Earth eventually recovered from the Great Dying. Life adapted, evolved, filled the empty niches. But the recovery wasn't guaranteed, and it certainly wasn't quick. The planet's self-regulating systems, all these feedback loops that normally maintain stability, they can break. Once broken, they take geological timescales to repair. Modern Earth is more resilient than Permian Earth in some ways. We have more biodiversity to start with, which provides more insurance against total collapse. We have ice caps that can moderate climate swings. We have complex ecosystems that have survived multiple mass extinctions and learned, in an evolutionary sense, how to be robust. But we're also more vulnerable in other ways. Human civilization depends on stability. Our food systems, our cities, our entire way of life assumes the climate will stay roughly as it has been for the past 10,000 years. We don't have 10 million years to adapt to a new world. We barely have 10 decades. The timescales are what really separate us from the ancient catastrophe. The Siberian traps erupted for 2 million years. That's a slow burn by geological standards. It gave the Earth system time to respond, to try various feedback mechanisms, to seek new equilibria. It didn't prevent catastrophe, but it meant the catastrophe unfolded over thousands of generations of most species. Many populations could migrate, adapt, or at least suffer through periods of crisis and recover during brief windows of stability. We're compressing all that change into a handful of human lifetimes. Someone born today might live to see atmospheric CO2 levels that haven't existed for millions of years. They might witness the collapse of ecosystems that have been stable since the last ice age, not because we're releasing more carbon than the Siberian traps, though we're working on it, but because we're releasing it so much faster. Speed matters. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual change. They've done it countless times, but rapid change breaks adaptation. Species can't evolve fast enough. Communities can't reorganize quickly enough. Food webs unravel in real time. Yet here's the paradox that makes the Great Dying both cautionary tale and source of strange comfort. Life survived. Not easily, not quickly, not without catastrophic losses, but it survived. The planet endured what might be the worst environmental disaster in the history of complex life, and eventually, after millions of years of patient recovery, produced forests and oceans and ecosystems even more diverse than what came before. Earth is tough, tougher than we sometimes imagine. It survived asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, ice ages, hothouse climates, rearranged continents, and inverted magnetic fields. Life has been knocked down to the edge of extinction at least 5 times, and every time it's eventually bounced back. But, and this is crucial, bouncing back takes time, geological time, the kind of time that means nothing to rocks but everything to species living through the crisis. The Great Dying killed 90% of all species. The survivors endured millions of years of degraded ecosystems before things finally stabilized. From their perspective, from the viewpoint of any animal trying to survive in that hellish world, there was no recovery. There was only suffering until death. We can take comfort in Earth's ultimate resilience. The planet will be fine in the long run, but we don't live in the long run. We live in the next few generations, and those generations might be experiencing the early stages of changes that, if left unchecked, could echo across millions of years. The rocks don't lie. They tell us that when you rapidly change atmospheric composition, bad things happen. When you warm the climate past certain thresholds, feedback loops kick in that amplify the warming. When you acidify the oceans and deplete their oxygen, marine ecosystems collapse. These aren't theories, these are observations. This happened. The evidence is literally written in stone. But the rocks also tell us something else. They tell us that every extinction, no matter how severe, is also an opportunity. The survivors of the Great Dying inherited a world with empty niches and unlimited possibilities. They evolved into forms that would have seemed impossible before the crisis. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the modern fish groups, they all owe their existence to the ecological vacuum created by the extinction. We stand at a similar threshold, not facing a crisis as severe as the Permian extinction, not yet, maybe never, but facing changes rapid enough and large enough that they'll reshape the world our descendants inherit. The choices we make now in these next few decades will echo across millennia. They'll determine which species survive and which disappear. They'll influence how quickly ecosystems can recover when the crisis passes. They'll shape the world that eventually emerges from whatever changes we set in motion. The Great Dying teaches us that Earth has limits, that natural systems can break, that recovery is possible but not guaranteed, and never fast. It teaches us humility in the face of geological forces and respect for the complex systems that maintain habitability. Most importantly, it teaches us that we have evidence. We're not guessing about what happens when you destabilize Earth's climate. We've seen it before. We know how it ends. The only question is whether we're smart enough to learn from history written in stone, or whether we'll insist on repeating experiments whose results we already know. And so we reach the end of our journey through the deepest catastrophe life has ever faced. The Great Dying, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the moment when 90% of all species vanished from Earth in what might have been just a few thousand years. Geologically an instant, biologically an apocalypse. Think about what we've witnessed together tonight. A world where continents collided to form a single massive supercontinent, where volcanic eruptions lasted for millennia, pumping poison into the sky, where oceans turned acidic and lost their oxygen, where temperatures soared to levels that made most of the planet uninhabitable, where forests burned and deserts spread, and the very chemistry of the atmosphere became hostile to life. 252 million years ago, Earth became hell, not metaphorically, literally, a furnace planet where survival became almost impossible. And yet, life held on, not everywhere, not easily, not without unimaginable suffering and loss, but it held on, in coastal shallows where oxygen still penetrated, in high-latitude refuges where temperatures remained just barely tolerable, in underground burrows where small creatures waited out the worst of the heat, in those scattered, precious places where conditions aligned just right to let something, anything, survive. those survivors weren't the strongest or the fastest or the most impressive species. They were the lucky ones, the ones who happened to be in the right place with the right adaptations when everything went wrong. A small mammal ancestor no bigger than a rat. A reptile that could dig deep enough to escape the heat. A plant with seeds tough enough to wait years for conditions to improve. A fungus that thrived on death itself. From those desperate survivors came everything that followed. Every dinosaur that ever walked the earth descended from those Triassic reptiles who made it through. Every mammal, including us, traces its lineage back to those tiny burrowing creatures who survived by being small and adaptable. Every flowering plant that brightens our world today evolved from the hardy species that colonized the devastated landscapes of the early Triassic. We exist because life is more stubborn than we can possibly imagine. Because even when 90% of all species die, that last 10% refuses to give up. Because evolution isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. About trying again, generation after generation, even when the odds are impossibly stacked against you. The Great Dying teaches us something profound about both fragility and resilience. It shows us that complex ecosystems built over hundreds of millions of years can collapse in geological moments when conditions change too fast. That biodiversity isn't guaranteed. That life's grip on this planet, though tenacious, has come terrifyingly close to failing completely. But it also shows us that life is more creative, more adaptive, more persistent than any extinction event. That even the worst catastrophe imaginable couldn't sterilize the planet. That given even the smallest foothold, life will explode back into every available niche, reinventing itself in forms more diverse and complex than before. The world that emerged from the Great Dying was strange and impoverished at first, but 10 million years later, dinosaurs were beginning their rise. 100 million years later, they dominated the planet. And when their time ended in another mass extinction, the mammals who inherited the Earth were still carrying genes that had survived the Permian fires. Every breath you take is possible because those ancient survivors kept breathing when the air itself was poison. Every species alive today, including humanity, exists because life refused to surrender, even when 90% of it died. That's the story we've explored together tonight. Not just death, but survival. Not just catastrophe, but recovery. Not just the worst extinction in Earth's history, but also the most incredible comeback story ever told. Thank you for joining me on this journey through deep time. If you enjoyed exploring the ancient world with me, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd leave a like on the video. It helps others discover these stories from Earth's deep past. And if you'd like to share your thoughts, I'd love to know what part of tonight's story fascinated you most, or where in the world you're listening from as you drift off to sleep. For those who want to support the channel, YouTube membership is available, but it's completely optional. No pressure whatsoever. This content is here for everyone who wants to explore Earth's incredible history. Wherever you are, whatever comfortable place you've found to rest, I hope tonight's journey through the Permian has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep. Sweet dreams of ancient worlds, of life's incredible resilience, of survivors who refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. Rest well. Until next time.